A shift just happened in the sky, and it might be quietly changing who you are. The surprising, even shocking truth about Venus forming a sextile to Chiron in Aries is not that something is breaking you beyond repair. It's that something you built to survive is being invited to retire. You may feel less eager to perform, less hungry for applause, and bewildered by the subtle grief of losing a version of yourself that once kept you safe. This transit is a signal more than a sentence. It points to a recalibration of attraction, aesthetics, and identity that often shows up first as a soft dimming, then becomes unmistakable in the weeks that follow. Imagine for a moment a bodyguard who has stood between you and the world for years, hyper-vigilant, always ready to fight or charm on your behalf. Now, picture that bodyguard taking off their armor, folding it carefully, and placing it on a shelf. That act looks like loss at first. It can feel like vulnerability. But the shelf is not empty for long. Something quieter, truer, less performative moves in. That is the core of what this Venus-Chiron tone tends to reveal, the retirement of protective identity and the emergence of presence. What does this actually feel like day to day? There are concrete signs you may recognize. Your charm might feel different, less performative. You'll catch yourself thinking, that version of me feels like a costume. You might find yourself canceling plans more often, softly, politely, without the old chest-tight fear that you're letting people down. Old posts and photos that used to feel like trophies could suddenly feel embarrassing. You delete them, archive them, or scroll past without longing. You might feel second-hand embarrassment when you remember how you once performed for approval. And it's not a panic so much as a wince and a sigh. Attraction can change. The people who once magnetized you, often emotionally unavailable or chaotic types, start to feel exhausting rather than exciting. Your wardrobe might shift. Clothes that once screamed a message of worthiness feel like a costume, and you find yourself drawn to garments that declare comfort, clarity, or authenticity over flash. Emotional neutrality shows up for some. It's not the deadness people fear, but a calm steadiness that replaces frantic people-pleasing. Boundaries become less negotiable, not because you've hardened, but because the currency of exchange in your relationships is being recalculated. If any of that is landing for you, pause for a moment. This is the kind of transit that can feel confusing because the internal changes precede the external ones. The sky nudges your inner economy before your life has had time to catch up. If this is resonating, consider dropping your sun or rising sign in the comments. I'd love to hear which part of your chart is waking up. And if this message is showing up at a pivotal moment, go ahead and like the video so it reaches someone who needs this reassurance. To make sense of these shifts without turning them into fate, let's name the players briefly. Venus represents desire, aesthetics, how you value pleasure and connection, and the kinds of beauty and charm you put into the world. Chiron is the archetype of the wound and the paradoxical healer, where the ache that shaped you can also lead you to deeper wisdom. Aries is the sign of identity, initiation, and the fierce I am impulse. When Venus forms a sextile to Chiron in Aries, it brings a gentle but pointed conversation between how you seek value and the place where old wounds shaped your self-presentation. It's less about dramatic metamorphosis overnight and more about the universe handing you a new set of keys and asking, almost imperceptibly, if you want to open a different door. Why would that make your social spark feel dimmer? Because many of our outward charms are compensations built from earlier hurts. Consider 3 protective identities that often populate this landscape. First, the overachiever. Someone who learned early that success and visible achievement kept rejection at bay. You polished every performance because proof of worth felt like safety. Under this transit, that drive can feel less vital. The trophy room becomes quieter, and the inner motivation shifts from proving to creating. Second, the pleaser. shaped by the belief that harmony and self-erasure secured love. You learned to read moods and anticipate needs to avoid abandonment. Now what once felt like mastery of social grace may seem exhausting or unnecessary. Third, the fixer, the version of you who took on other people's mess as proof you were needed. That role can start to feel like unpaid labor rather than meaningful service. These identities are not mistakes. They were intelligent solutions at a time you needed them. The cosmic invitation now is to allow them to step down when they've fulfilled their job. Sometimes that stepping down looks like grief. Grief here is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It's the emotional bookkeeping that happens when a protective faculty retires. You might mourn the attention you used to receive, the certainty of your role in social scripts, or even the adrenaline rush of being the rescuer. If grief arises, let it be acknowledged. Say to yourself, I honored this role when I needed it. Now I'm letting it rest. Framing the process as a retirement ritual, complete with gratitude for service rendered, helps you move from shame or panic into curiosity. It's a small, tender practice. Name the protective identity, thank it for protecting you, and allow yourself to imagine it taking a bow. This transit also recalibrates attraction in specific ways. If you've been magnetized by dramatic intensity, unavailability, or emotional chaos, you may notice those patterns losing their grip. That doesn't mean you will never be attracted to complexity again, but the emotional payoff of chasing wounds as a form of romance begins to look less appealing. Instead, resonance, mutuality, steadiness, and a sense of being seen without performance can start to matter more. You might find yourself less interested in people who require constant emotional labor and more drawn to those who match your capacity for reciprocity. Attraction becomes less about fixing or proving and more about recognition. Aesthetic shift along with attraction. Where you once dressed to announce your value, you may now dress to reflect how you feel inside. Softer lines, fewer loud declarations, a preference for authenticity. For some, this means an effortless elegance. For others, a practical, pared-back look that prioritizes comfort and coherence. That outward change is not vanity dying. It is your inner realignment expressing itself in color, cut, and choice. Clothes become declarations. I am not an apology. I'm not an act. I am myself. Emotional neutrality can be a confusing friend in this dance. It is often mistaken for apathy, but usually it's a recalibrated shield. When you stop doing the constant emotional labor that used to maintain relationships, entertaining, soothing, performing, you might appear calmer, less reactive. That steadiness is a form of self-respect. But because many of us equate intense responsiveness with care, others may misread your quiet as coldness. Notice where you're being misread, and also notice where your energy is more available for the people who reciprocate, rather than those who expect you to carry them. Boundaries become clearer during this transit, not because you are tougher, but because the currency of your exchange is changing. You begin to recognize when your energy is being used as proof of someone else's worth. The new instinct often says no before the old instinct says bend. That can be disorienting because the roles you've relied on, peacemaker, performer, problem solver, suddenly feel optional. That option creates space for relationships built on mutuality instead of extraction. You may need to practice the language of boundary setting in small ways at first. Fewer last-minute favors, clearer expectations, honest adjustments about capacity. None of this is about punishing yourself or others. It's about aligning daily exchanges with your evolving value system. It's also important to be gentle with the idea of neutrality. When you step out of hyper-approval seeking, it may appear that your emotional range has narrowed. That narrowing is often a sign of emotional economy. You reserve intense emotional labor for those who meet you halfway. If you notice a tendency toward numbness rather than calm, that's a different signal, one that might merit support from trusted friends or professionals. Astrology can map influence. It can't and shouldn't replace the care that human relationships and trained professionals provide. Let me give you a scenario to make this tactile. Picture someone who for years curated their Instagram to look impeccable because likes and comments felt like proof that they weren't invisible. Under this transit, they wake up and suddenly the endless editing feels exhausting. They archive older posts that feel like performances, and they begin posting less polished content, a grainy photo, a short, candid caption. Comments are fewer, but the ones that remain feel more honest. Their follower count may plateau or even dip, and for a moment they mourn the visible validation. But what fills that hole is quieter. Messages from people who resonate, invitations to real conversations, and a sense of relief that their private life is less curated for public approval. Another example. Someone who habitually became the problem solver in relationships, the one who smoothed conflicts, absorbed blame, and fixed crises so others could continue unaffected, starts to notice exhaustion. They say yes less. They stop answering at 3 in the morning for problems that aren't theirs to carry. Initially, guilt pops up. Am I selfish? But over time, they find that people who value them still come through, and those who relied on their labor without reciprocity drift away. This is painful, yes, but also purifying. Relationships that remain are more likely to be reciprocal. We should also talk about the sense of identity leakage. Like your edges are blurring. When a constructed persona retires, there's a vacuum where certain roles once sat. That emptiness is not a failure, it's a necessary clearing. The temptation is to fill it with a new performance, another armor. But what if you let the space be a laboratory instead? Give yourself permission to experiment with smaller, more authentic choices. Wear what actually comforts you this week. Say no to one social obligation that feels performative. Watch what changes in your energy. Notice how your body responds when you do less to be seen. There are practical observational prompts you can use to track this transit without turning it into a project. Ask yourself, when did I last cancel plans and feel calibration rather than panic? Which past social performances make me cringe, and what did they protect me from? Who am I no longer willing to chase to prove my worth? What clothing or aesthetic choices feel like armor and which feel like reflection? These questions are invitations to witness, not commands to fix. Your answers will be personal, and that is the point. The transit is about individualized recalibration, not a universal prescription. If the grief becomes heavy, name it out loud. I am grieving the applause I used to rely on. Give that grief permission to have ritual recognition. Write a letter to your former persona, acknowledging its service. This is not about worshipping the past. It's about completing a chapter with gratitude. Rituals help mark transitions. They don't heal instantaneously, but they provide context and meaning for the change. There's also an important nuance about timing. This shift often shows up quietly at first, withdrawn texts, fewer posts, a cooler attraction to drama, and then reality catches up. Because our outer lives are slow-moving, you might only notice the broader consequences weeks or months later. Different group dynamics, a new aesthetic, or an unexpected partnership that feels like mutual currency. That delay can make the inner change feel frightening and premature. Remember, internal reorganization precedes external evidence. That is normal and signals that the process is working at a deeper level. For relationships, the practical consequence is worth naming. You may feel less willing to carry unequal emotional loads. That could mean asking for more reciprocity, recalibrating expectations, or stepping back from relationships that thrive on your performative care. None of this needs to be dramatic. Small, clear adjustments, saying, I can help with X but not Y, or setting a limit on last-minute availability, can be powerful. You're not obliged to narrate the transit to everyone. Sometimes the shift is internal, and your life quietly sorts itself into more aligned patterns. Let me address a couple of worries head-on. If you fear losing your spark, you're not losing your essence. The sparkle derived from validation and performance may fade, but what often emerges is a steadier, more magnetic presence. Presence is different from performative sparkle. It draws people who resonate rather than those seeking to project weaknesses onto you. If you fear being judged for changing, understandable, remind yourself that any evolution invites misunderstanding. That's part of the price of growth. It does not mean you were wrong to change. If you're tempted to panic and make sweeping life decisions, don't. This transit is an orienting signal, not a command. Decisive actions can be taken, but consider giving yourself time to observe and integrate before making permanent moves. If you feel overwhelmed by intense emotional patterns or trauma resurfacing, professional support can be a stabilizing resource. Astrology helps you name what's shifting. Trained therapists and trusted confidants can help you navigate what comes up safely. One of my favorite reframes to keep close is this: what you perceive as loss is often an upgrade. The bodyguard did its job, kept you safe when you needed protection. Now, however, safety may be secured by other ways: clearer boundaries, wiser choices, community that sees you without tests. This is not a reduction, but a reallocation of energy toward authenticity, not performance. The shocking truth, then, is not that something bad is happening. It's that the cosmos is gently encouraging an identity that requires less maintenance and more honesty. If you're still with me, thank you for staying. That presence itself is part of the work, witnessing your own inner shifts without needing immediate fixes. Let me leave you with a few small, compassionate practices that honor this transit without turning it into a taskmaster. First, practice compassionate inventory. Once a week, take 5 minutes to note 3 moments you acted from authenticity rather than performance. No judgment, just noting. Second, practice a retirement ritual. Write a short gratitude note to the identity that protected you. Acknowledge its service and mentally release it. Third, notice micro-boundaries. Decline one invitation that feels performative and observe how your energy responds. And finally, remember the language of possibility. You may find that the people who remain are those who love you for quieter reasons. You may find new aesthetics that actually feel like you. You may discover that life needs less theater and more honest conversation. None of this is guaranteed, but these are the kinds of changes Venus, sextile Chiron in Aries often ushers in. So to restate the central truth clearly, the shocking revelation isn't that you're doomed or broken. It's that what feels like loss is often the system finally making room for a truer, lighter self. The grief is real, and it's also evidence that change matters. Treat the grief with tenderness, honor the protective self that served you, and give yourself time to meet the quieter person emerging. If you want to go deeper with this transit, how it may be influencing specific placements in your chart or practical reflection prompts tailored to your sign, I have a transit guide and a short worksheet that walks you through personalized observations and gentle practices. Check the link in the description to download it, or head to the playlist for a deeper dive into how identity transits unfold. And if this spoke to you, please leave your sign below and share what's shifting. Your story might be exactly the mirror someone else needs to see.